Friends, this morning we are continuing our sermon series called Got Questions. Last week we introduced the series and talked about how important it is for us to ask questions, particularly of God, so that we can gain wisdom and knowledge, which is what God wants for us. And so today we're looking at our first question: why was Jesus born poor? And this morning I'm reading from Matthew 25, starting with verse 31. Now when the human one comes in his majesty, and all his angels are with him, he will sit on his majestic throne. All the nations will be gathered in front of him. He will separate them each from each other, just as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right side, but the goats he will put on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you will receive good things from my Father. Inherit the kingdom that was prepared for you before the world began. I was hungry, and you gave me food to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothes to wear. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then those who are righteous will reply to him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you a drink? When did we see you as a stranger and welcome you, or naked and give you clothes to wear? When did we see you sick or in prison and visit you?" Then the king will reply to them, "I assure you that when you have done it for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you have done it for me." May God add blessing to the reading, hearing, and understanding of these words. So I'm going to start this message with a question. How long after Christmas do you leave your decorations up? A few days? A few weeks? A few months? Maybe until Christmas next year? Well, last Friday, a group of us came here and undecorated the church because, you're really supposed to take your decorations down after Epiphany Sunday. And as I packed the nativity, our beautiful nativity, back in the box, and I put baby Jesus and his manger back in the closet, I felt a little sad because that meant Christmas was over. But Christmas is still fresh in our minds. And so it seems both timely and appropriate that the first question we should ask ourselves in this new series is about Jesus' birth. What's more, the question that we are asking today, why was Jesus born poor, is a popular one, asked by children and adults alike. So, why was Jesus born poor? Before we answer that question, we need to clarify something. How do we know that Jesus was born poor? Well, for that, we will turn to our Bibles and also to a very wise theologian, one of my favorites, Adam Hamilton. In his book called The Journey, Walking the Road to Bethlehem, Pastor Adam tells us more about Jesus' earthly parents and their social status in the first century. So first, let's talk about Mary. Mary came from Nazareth, one of 63 villages in Galilee. In Jesus' day, it was an insignificant town, not far from Sepphoris, which was much larger and much more affluent. How do we know that? Because archaeological excavations have uncovered many ruins of luxurious villas in Sepphoris, with extravagant mosaic tile floors that only the wealthy could afford. But in Nazareth, there were few, if any, mosaic floors found. There were few, if any, luxurious villas discovered. Nazareth was a town full of farmers shepherds, and laborers who made their homes in and around caves. Tradition holds that Mary's childhood home was in one of those caves, which is now located under the Church of the Annunciation, which is a very good indicator that she came from a poor family. And then there is Joseph. The Bible tells us even less about him. We know that Bethlehem was his childhood home because when it came time for them to take the census and everyone was ordered back to their own hometowns, Joseph and his wife Mary went to Bethlehem to be counted along with the others. Luke tells us that Joseph was a righteous man, but that's really all that he says about Joseph, which is unusual for Luke because he's usually very detailed. So if we want to know more about Joseph, we have to turn to Mark's Gospel, chapter 6, where we learn that Jesus was a tekton, which means his father was probably a tekton too. Now, I realize that probably your Greek is not as good as some folks, but tekton is the Greek word used by Mark to describe Jesus' occupation. And since Jesus was a tekton, his father was probably a tekton too. That means that the word tekton could have referred to someone who was a woodworker, a craftsman, or even a stonemason. And since neither Jesus nor his father were described as an archtekton or a master craftsman, then they probably were simple laborers, and their family was not among the wealthy. But the most telling piece of evidence about the couple's social status is what we find in Luke 2, verse 24, part of the scripture that Shane read for us earlier. There, Luke says that in accordance with Jewish law, Mary and Joseph took the baby on the 8th day of his life. They took him to Jerusalem to be dedicated to the Lord. And there, his parents offered a sacrifice of 2 birds, either turtle doves or young pigeons. Now, according to the law in Leviticus 12, the proper offering for the dedication of a baby was a 1-year-old lamb as a burnt offering and a pigeon or a turtle dove as a purification offering to the priest. Jennifer and Corey, I hope that you brought your lambs and birds today. Clearly, since Mary and Joseph gave an offering of 2 birds, they could not afford to give a larger animal. So we can say with certainty that Jesus was born to a poor family. But why? That's the question that we really want answered. Couldn't he have been more successful in his ministry had he been born into a family that was rich? Well, Billy Graham offers us 2 possible answers to the question of why Jesus was born poor. First, he suggests that Jesus was born into a poor working-class family to show that he came to bring salvation to everyone, not just the rich and the powerful. God's love extends to the whole human race, Graham wrote in December 2012, and where we find that on his Q&A page of his website. He goes on to say, and Jesus showed us the depth of God's love by willingly sharing in our poverty, which is the second suggestion that Jesus was born poor. Graham asserts that he did that so that his followers would know he understood what it meant to be poor. And while these certainly are valid thoughts, I'm not sure they tell the whole story. I think God intended something more. Reverend Dawn Chesser from our United Methodist Discipleship Ministries suggests a different reason why Jesus was born poor. She suggests that it was to increase our awareness of poverty in the world, a conclusion she draws especially from the parable of the Last Judgment. The challenge that Jesus gives us in this teaching, she writes, is to look at people not with the eyes of humanity, but with the eyes of God. What do we see when we look at the poor, she asks. What assumptions do we make about them? This passage reminds us in the starkest terms possible of one of the key messages Jesus brought into this world, that those whom this world considers insignificant are very significant to God. Jesus' birth into a poor family was designed to help us be more aware of the plight of the poor. And so, since that is the case, let's look at that using some myths that might cloud our vision when we consider the problem of poverty. In a weekly series called MTV Decoded, comedian Francesca Ramsey tackles uncomfortable subjects in a thought-provoking yet humorous way. And on December 8th of last year, she posted a video blog called 5 Poverty Myths Debunked. And here is what she shared. Myth number 1, poor people are lazy. Now, this simply is not true, at least not 100%. The truth is, the majority of Americans living in poverty are working one or more jobs. But unfortunately, most of those jobs are part-time. They would like to work full-time, but those jobs are just not available. Not anymore. And since the 1970s, she shares, wages have basically remained flat, while the cost of living has continued to rise, creating even a greater divide between what they take home in their take-home pay and what they have to pay out in order to meet basic needs like housing, utilities, even food. And 35% of the poor don't work, 35% of the poor who don't work are people who can't work, children, the elderly, and the disabled. So the myth that the reason people are poor is because they are lazy simply is not true. So myth number 1, busted. You didn't know we were going to do Mythbusters today, right? The second myth is this. If poor people just laid off the booze and the drugs, they wouldn't be poor. Well, now the truth is, drinking alcohol and taking drugs doesn't make people poor. If that were the case, a much larger part of our population would be living in cardboard boxes, right? And while drug and alcohol abuse are issues for some poor people, it is not a major cause of poverty. A point that was proven after several states, including Arizona, started drug testing welfare applicants. While they expected to find that a majority of welfare applicants were substance abusers, what they actually found was the opposite. That those living at or below the poverty line had a lower rate of drug use than the population at large. 9.4% for the general population compared to 0.002 to 8.3% for those in the welfare population. It turns out drugs and alcohol are expensive, and the majority of poor people just can't afford them. Yeah, who knew? So myth number 2, busted. Which brings us to myth number 3. If poor people just studied harder and went to college, they would be just fine. Here, Francesca points out that while going to college is a good goal to have, it isn't a cure-all for poverty. The biggest problem with education in this country is that public schools are primarily funded by local taxes. And that means that high poverty districts will have less money to spend per student than those in wealthier areas, 15.6% less. So poor neighborhoods have poorer schools, and poorer schools tend to have lower student success rates. Oh, and here's a fun fact for you. Did you know that college tuition has increased 1,120% since 1978? Yeah, it's true. And what's more, getting a degree doesn't mean you'll make boatloads of money. I know, I have 3 of them. Many college graduates are finding it harder and harder to get a job, even with a degree in their chosen fields. So the notion that a college education solves our poverty woes is simply not true. So myth number 3, busted. And then there's myth number 4, which quite frankly makes me very uncomfortable even to say it, because it's racist, plain and simple. The myth is that most poor people in this country are the blacks who live in the inner city. Now, the truth is, when it comes to actual numbers of poor people, there are way more white people who are poor than any other race. According to a recent study published by the Kaiser Family Foundation, 19.7 million white people are poor, compared to 10.8 million black people, 13.1 million Hispanic people, and 2.1 million Asians. So then, why do people think otherwise? Well, unfortunately, our media outlets tend to present the poor as black people living in the inner city, which does a disservice to everyone when they do that. Because it makes black people are made out to be something that they are not. And the plight of poor white people is virtually ignored. So myth number 4, busted. And finally, we come to myth number 5. This is the last one, folks. This myth says that being poor in America is better than being poor somewhere else. Yeah, no, this is just wrong. When I first heard this, I thought, who would say such a thing? Well, it turns out that, again, this myth is perpetuated by the media, and it really is fake news. Because the truth is, being poor is the pits, no matter where you live. But since we are focusing on poverty in America, get this. There are 1.5 million American households living on less than $2 per person per day. Think about that. Less than $2 per person per day. That's below the global extreme poverty level. And 13 million children in America live in households that lack the means to buy nutritious food on a regular basis. We see this in our own community, where close to 100% of the children in our neighborhood schools are on the free and reduced lunch program through the school district. And that program, that's just going to get worse, because our legislators in Washington are determined to cut funding to these programs across the board in our country. So being poor in America really isn't any better than being poor someplace else. So myth number 5, busted! Now, I'm sure there are more myths about poverty that need to be busted, but until we educate ourselves and identify ways to address some of these issues, until we stop thinking that being poor is a moral failing, or that poor people are bad people, these myths and others will continue to run rampant. But when we do become more aware of the real reasons behind the problem of poverty, then maybe we can come up with better ways of working with those who are poor so that they can get out of the cycle of poverty. Our own 19 North initiative is sponsoring educational opportunities for us so that we can become more informed about poverty in our community. And then we can do something about it, which I believe is a good thing. And I believe it's what Jesus would want us to do. So why was Jesus born poor? Maybe it is because God wanted to show that salvation is for everyone, regardless of social status. Or maybe God wanted us to understand that Jesus understood what it meant to be poor, therefore raising his credibility with the masses. Or maybe, just maybe, God wanted to help us have more compassion for the poor and to remember that those whom this world considers insignificant are very significant to God. Maybe God wanted God's people to be agents of change, who will work to develop meaningful solutions to the problem of poverty in our country and in the world. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come and inherit the kingdom. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. Naked, and you gave me clothes. Sick, and you took care of me. In prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will ask, "Lord, when did we do these things?" And the king will reply, "When you did it for one of the least of these, my brothers and my sisters, you did it to me." Amen.